Boker Tov, everyone. Good morning. We are on page 918. Beginning of Parshas Maseh, still 918, as we are learning about the journeys that Bnei Yisrael took. But before we get started with the journeys, we mentioned last week, Pasuk Dalid, that Bnei Yisrael left Mitzrayim, Biyad Ramah, the end of Pasuk Gimel, Yatsu Bnei Yisrael Biyad Ramah le'enei kol Mitzrayim. That they left Biyad Ramah. Biyad Ramah means what? With uplifted, they left, fight, right? That's how they left Mitzrayim, okay? And le'enei kol Mitzrayim in front, in the presence of everyone. So, interestingly, the next pasuk says, what were they doing? What were the Egyptians doing? The Egyptians, Mitzrayim mekabrim es asher hikah Hashem bahem. Right? The Egyptians were busy burying the ones who were killed. And we mentioned last week, not only the firstborn, but if there were no firstborn in the house, so the oldest one in the house died. So what happened? So the Egyptians were busy burying them. What's the connection between these two statements? So the Netziv has a fascinating idea. The Netziv writes, Lefi shebe'emes lo noda leMitzrayim shebeda'asam shelo lashuv lehishtabed lahem. Right? You ever had, we know that in the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim, what did Bnei Yisrael do? They went to the Egyptians and they borrowed, right, klei zahav, uklei kesef, silver and gold utensils. They borrowed them, right? They borrowed them, right? Now, vayashilum, right? What does the word vayashilum mean? They borrowed them. The implication of borrowing something is returning it, unless you're married, in which case borrowing something means you'll never get it back, right? But under normal circumstances, somebody wants to borrow something, the implication is they're going to return it. Imagine your neighbor, Bnei Yisrael, knocks on the door and says, by the way, can I borrow your silver pot, your whatever it is? You expect to get it back. And now what happens? And now the Bnei Yisrael abscond with all of these kalim of the Egyptians. Which, by the way, leads to a fascinating Gemara. There's a great Gemara. What? Forget toiveling, forget kashering. This is all pre-Matan Torah. Forget toiveling, forget kashering. It's all pre-Matan Torah. What happened? Of course, I'm telling you, we have this. Women think about the practical things. No man would ever ask, but you have to toivel it, right? No man, but because men don't think practically, women think practically. I'm just generalizing. I'm sure there are some men who think practically, although I don't know any. And I'm sure there are some women who don't think practically, although I don't know any either. But okay, so this is the idea. This leads to a very interesting Gemara. The Gemara says that the Egyptians summoned the Jews in a Roman court. Why? Think about The Hague. Think about what's going on now, right? The Egyptians went to the Romans and subpoenaed the Jews to appear. Why? Because they wanted to claim you owe us money because you stole all of these silver and gold items from us. You said you were borrowing them and you never came back. You stole all of these items. So they summoned the Jews, and the Jews sent a representative, and the representative they sent, I think his name was Gviha ben Psis. I don't remember 100%. There's one particular rabbi who had a hunchback. He was known as this, and he was the one who, he said, send me. This way, if I answer them, if I answer their summons correctly, okay, and if not, you can blame it on they sent a hunchback, that was a physical defect. So he went, Gviya ben Psis, I think that was the name. So he goes, and how does he counter this argument? He says to them, okay, let's do a cheshbon. Let's figure out, we worked for you for 210 years. what's the minimum hourly pay? Let's figure out who owes who money. And at that point, the Egyptian said, "Okay, we're done. We're leaving here." So he was successful in defending the Jewish people. But the bottom line is, the implication of this story in the Gemara is that the Jews stole because they said they were borrowing. Saying that you're borrowing implies what's going to happen, that you're coming back. So here, what do we see? We see that Bnei Israel left Mitzrayim biyad Ramah. So imagine you're an Egyptian, right? Your Jewish neighbor just borrowed your gold and silver. And now you look out and what do you see out your window?
Gold and silver.
Right? Forget the gold. I see all of Bnei Israel, the moving trucks, right? Moving trucks and they're going out, banners, flags, they're going biyad Ramah. What am I thinking to myself? What's going on here? Something's not kosher. Right? If I'm an Egyptian, I'm thinking something's not kosher here. Why? They just borrowed this gold and the silver. If it's cold and you want me to shut that off. All right, it borrowed the gold and the silver, and what happens? And now they're leaving biyad Ramah. Like, what's going on here? So imagine you're the Egyptians and you see this. So what do you want to do? Right, you're the Egyptians and you see this. What do you want to do? You want to say, something's up. Confront the Jews, but they didn't do that. Why not? Why didn't the Egyptians do that? They saw the Jews leaving biyad Ramah. They saw the Jews leaving with their moving. Because they were distracted by their burials. They were distracted by their burials. So this is the opinion which the Netziv mentions, right? Where the Netziv says, "Lefi shebe'emes lo noda leMitzrayim shebeda'asam shelo lashuv lehishtabed." The average Egyptian didn't know that they were not coming back. In fact, who kicked them out of the land? Paro. Paro didn't want them back, but the average Egyptian didn't know what was going on. So the average Egyptian sees this thing so our pasuk tells us, no, the average Egyptian was distracted by burying their firstborn. Right? We're going to see they buried actually more than the firstborn, but distracted by burying their firstborn. Interestingly, this is not the first time that such a tactic has been used by Hashem. There was another time where this tactic was used by Hashem, and that was during the time of the Meraglim. The Meraglim went into Eretz Yisrael and came back and reported that there were giants. Reported that it was an Eretz Ocheles Es Yoshveha. It was a land that consumed its inhabitants, because everywhere they went, what happened? Everywhere they went, there were funerals. Why were there funerals everywhere where the Meraglim went? Because HaKadosh Baruch Hu Dafka set up those funerals so that Bnei Israel would not be detected. The Meraglim would not, because all of the natives in the land were busy with the funerals. They were distracted. They didn't pay attention to these Meraglim traveling through the land. So it seems that HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, worked once, I'll try it again. Kadosh Baruch Hu did it here, specifically when Bnei Israel left Mitzrayim. Started with these funerals, and that's right. So it's interesting, because if you look at the pasuk, what does the pasuk say? U'Mitzrayim mekabrim eis asher hikah Hashem bahem. Right? That the Egyptians were busy burying that which Hashem smote. Love that word. Specifically, kol bechor, every bechor, and we know that every bechor doesn't only mean every firstborn. It means the oldest if there was no firstborn in the house. Uvelo heihem asa Hashem shvatim, and against their gods, against the deities that the Egyptians worshipped, gods with a small g, Hashem created shvatim. What is shvatim? Could come from shofet, justice. Hashem created signs. Hashem made it clear that these items were powerless. right? So we know one prime example of Hashem making it clear that these items were powerless was the fact that the Karban Pesach, which is an animal that the Egyptians worship, had to be tied up outside of the Jewish home for 4 days before Yetzias Mitzrayim. Now, you're the average Egyptian and you pass by the Jew's house, and what's tied up? Right? You pass by the house, you look in the driveway, you see there's a Mercedes and there's a Lincoln and there's a Range Rover. Okay, no big deal. Okay, I get it. And now you see, but wait a second, there's a lamb that's tied up. Right? A lamb that's tied up, that's already a big deal. Why? Because we worship the lambs. What are they doing tying up our gods, our divinity? So that was for 4 days. Why 4 days? 4 days because the Jews had to make sure that the lambs that they were going to offer as sacrifices did not have any blemishes. So they were observed, they were checked for 4 days. They were checked for 4 days. Okay, interesting. You want to hear something? When do we begin Ashkenazim? When do Ashkenazim begin Slichos? Motzei Shabbos before Rosh Hashanah, as long as there are 4 days before Rosh Hashanah. If there are not 4 days before Rosh Hashanah, when do we begin Slichos? A week earlier. Why do we need at least 4 days before Rosh Hashanah? Because what's the idea, right? We need to examine ourselves for blemishes before we approach a Kadosh Baruch Hu. We're approaching a Kadosh Baruch Hu on Rosh Hashanah. We need to examine ourselves for blemishes. That takes 4 days. That's what the Slichos is all about. And if there's not 4, this year, Baruch Hashem. Right, this year, Baruch Hashem, when is Rosh Hashanah? When I ask you, whenever I ask you this year, when is a holiday, you always know to say Thursday, Friday, right? Everything, Thursday, Friday, Shabbos. 3 day Yom Tovim, okay? Lovely, okay. Right, 3 day Yom Tov, right? Thursday, Friday. By the way, this is fascinating because this is the only 3 day Yom Tov that Israel ever experiences. The only 3 day Yom Tov that Israel ever, and they go nuts, right? They absolutely go nuts because they're not even used to a 2 day Yom Tov. And now they have a 3 day, absolutely bonkers, right? They're absolutely bonkers. We are like, okay, all right, so it's not such a big deal. We're using, it's not as good as a 2 day Yom Tov, but okay, 3 days we'll live. Israel, they're like, it's like the end of the world.
But it's
right?
Rosh Hashanah in Israel 2 days.
Yeah, that's why I'm saying this is the way it falls out this year is the only time that Israel can ever have a 3 day Yom Tov, because it's Thursday, Friday, which they have to observe, because in Israel, Rosh Hashanah is 2 days, and then Shabbos.
It's 3 days to worry what the news will be after.
Okay. So all right. So what do we have? So we have this idea that I don't even remember how I got onto that discussion.
4 days.
Right. Oh, 4 days. Right. 4 days. So the Karban Pesach, 4 days before. So now we know Wednesday night is Rosh Hashanah. So we have our 4 days, right? We have Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. We have our 4 days, all right, of Slichos. So that's not a problem. Otherwise, in other years, we start a week earlier. So that's the 4 days. Sfardim started already saying Slichos Rosh Chodesh Elul. They do that because this is their kapara for eating rice on Pesach. Right? They're allowed to eat rice on Pesach, right? You can have rice on Pesach. You can have a kapara is you have to start getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning throughout the month of Elul. Okay. Now, but this is the 4 days, right? So what do we have? So we know that Hashem had Bnei Yisrael tie up the lamb. But not only did Hashem have Bnei Yisrael tie up the lamb, when it came time to slaughter the lamb and to cook the lamb, what kind of meat are you not supposed to have on Rosh Hashanah? You're not supposed to have roasted meat. This is, I'm sorry. Pesach. You're not supposed to have roasted meat on Pesach. And I always get a question: Vus mens du roasted? Right? How do you define it? There's a little bit of water. Is it roasted? Is it not roasted? All right. So we're talking about roasted. We're talking about on the barbecue, right? On the barbecue, over an open fire. That's how the Karban Pesach was cooked, and And when it was cooked on the barbecue over an open fire, being very descriptive, it was whole. Right? They literally put a skewer through the animal from one end to the other and roasted the animal that way. Why? Why over an open fire? Why the animal had to be whole? So imagine you're an Egyptian. And you're like, what is that? Right? What is that? What is that smell? Right? It smells like something cooking. And then you go over to where you think the smell is coming from, the Jew's backyard, and what do you see? Your God on the spit, right? Your God on the spit being roasted. So this is V'asa v'hem shvatim. This is what we say, Uve'eloheihem asa Hashem shvatim. But not only that, so there's a fascinating interpretation that says that not only was the Egyptian God, the God of the Egyptians, the lamb, not only was that killed, in other words, not only did Hashem show the Egyptians that God had no power, but Rabbeinu Bechaye says, Uvechol Elohei Mitzrayim E'aseh Shvatim Ani Hashem. He quotes the pasuk from Bishalach, which is the same idea here, and then he explains, V'hashvatim Hayu, what were these signs? What were these wonders? What was this judgment? Im Shel Kesef V'Zahav, if the God, the deity that the Egyptian worshipped was of silver or gold, I have my silver statue of who knows what on my mantle, what would happen? Says the Gemara, says Rabbeinu Bechaye, Nimses. What would happen to it?
First.
It would melt.
Oh.
Right? It would melt. Here's my silver statue, my golden statue on the mantle. All of a sudden, it's melted away. There's nothing there. Im shel eitz, and if it was a statue made out of wood, what would happen? Nir keves. What does nir keves mean?
Rotten.
Become rotten. In other words, this wood statue that I worship, what would happen to it? It would become rotten. So in other words, Hashem was sending these signs that not only the lamb, but because the Egyptians didn't only worship the land, right? They worshipped idols as well, statues. So if it was a gold or silver statue, it melted. If it was a wooden statue, what happened? It became rotten. If it was a stone statue, V'im shel even mispotzetzes, what happened? Shattered. Right? Shattered. In other words, Hashem said, oh yeah, you're worshiping these things, boom, 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 they're gone. Right? That was V'asa v'hem shvati.
Rabbi Polikoff?
Yes, Rosie.
What the it's almost like the gold statue is a foreboding of what will happen in the Midbar by the Jews.
By the Egel HaZahav, you're saying. Right, but it wasn't just gold. Gold, silver, wood, stone, whatever they worshiped, that's what happened. Right. Okay? Now, so this is what Rabbeinu Bechaye says. Very interesting, right? That Hashem performed these miraculous signs by the deities of the Egyptians is part of this. So imagine, now, what's the whole point of this? Because now, not only are you busy burying your firstborn, but what do you do at a time of mourning? Where do you turn at a time of mourning? You turn to something bigger than yourself, because if you've lost something, right? If you've lost a relative, you lose a firstborn child, you lose the oldest child in the house. So what happens? You're bereft. You don't know what to do. So when we don't know what to do, what do we turn to? Something bigger than ourselves. For us, we turn to Hashem. Right? For the Egyptians and for others, what did they turn to? They turned to their deities. And now what happened? Their deities are gone. So imagine Hashem creates a society that is completely bereft. Not only are they busy burying their children, but they have no one to turn to. Right? Everything that they used to turn to for guidance, for comfort, for chizuk, gone. Everything is gone. Not only that, so listen to this. So there's a fascinating commentary on Chumash, which is called Aim LaMikra. Aim LaMikra. Aim from the word imas, so to speak. Right? Aim LaMikra. It was written by a rabbi from the 19th century, an Italian rabbi, Rabbi Eliyahu ben Mojga, right? He's an Italian rabbi. Sounds like he was Farsi. I don't know. Italian rabbi. When he published it, so there were Jewish communities that ordered that it had to be burned. Because he was a shtickle academic, he relied on scholarship, archaeology, history, wasn't the classical kind of commentary. But it survived. And listen to what he says. It's a fascinating interpretation that he says here. He says, Mima shenismach el umitzrayim mekabrim, from the fact that you have two parts of this pasuk, right? Umitzrayim mekabrim, right? The Egyptians were busy burying everything that God smote. And then it says their firstborn. But what's right after it? Uve Eloheihem asa Hashem shvatim. From the fact that these two are next to each other in the pasuk, he Omer ani, I say, shehashvatim she'asa Hashem ve'Eloheihem heim misas habehemos hane'evados b'migdashehem miminim shonim. What were the shvatim? What were the signs that Hashem did? He caused all of the animals that were worshipped in Egypt to be killed. In other words, the Egyptians seemingly didn't just worship the lamb. The Egyptians worshipped other idols as well, other animals as well. And according to the Aim Lamikra, Hashem caused these animals to die. And now the Egyptians were busy burying these animals as well. They weren't just burying their Bechor or their oldest child. They were burying these animals as well. That's why the pasuk says, "Umitzrayim mikabrim es asher hika Hashem b'hem." It doesn't say "Umitzrayim mikabrim es kol Bechor." It says "Umitzrayim mikabrim es asher hika Hashem b'hem." Okay, right? So that's the idea. That's what the Egyptians were doing. And he says, "V'ad hayom kishechofrim bekarka Mitzrayim," that when you excavate do archaeological excavations in Egypt, what do you find? Motziim behemos ve'ofos chanutim. You find animals that are mummified, right? You find animals that are mummified, chanutim, ube'enai ri'isim, and I saw them myself. Vehein heim ba'atzmam osam shahayu b'shanim kadmonios, v'aleihem gam kein chozer omro mikabrim, v'ha'ed ha'shekasuv u'mitzrayim mikabrim eis kol asher yikashem. So what is he saying? He's saying not only were the Egyptians busy burying their children, but they were also burying all of these animals that they worshipped. So I said to myself, that's bizarre. Egyptians really mummified animals? Sure enough, there is a National Geographic magazine that talks about the mummified animals of Egypt.
Wow.
And describes all of the animals that were mummified and buried by the Egypt. The cats, the dogs, there was a particular kind of bird that they mummified also, right? These were animals that they worshipped. So he brings it in here, it's fascinating, right? He brings in from this archaeological perspective that you uncover mummified animals in Egypt, and he connects it to the fact that the Egyptians were busy burying. They weren't only burying their children, they were burying all of these things as well.
Did he write that before the animals were excavated?
He says he saw it himself. He saw the excavated animals. So he probably, unlikely that he wrote it before, he probably, from his own archaeological expeditions, saw this and then said, "Oh, now I understand the pasuk." Right, now I understand the pasuk. Right, if you never saw it, right, so then if you're not into archaeology, so it's irrelevant to you. But,
Italy isn't that far from Egypt.
no, not at all. Not at all.
So if you
wouldn't it be just the animals that were taken from the tombs of the pyramids? Because they had to look after the kings that were buried.
So there were animals that were like, if a paro died, if a king died and he had certain pets, these pets, like the dogs, there were dogs that were mummified because they were the royal dogs, if you will. But he's saying there are animals that were worshipped that were mummified as well.
Just buried and mummified.
I think mummified and then buried. Right, in that order. Okay. So just an interesting...
Falkov, why was he looked down on by the other Rabbanim?
He was looked down on because he's writing a biblical commentary employing archaeology.
Thank God.
Right, that's not exactly a 19th century Italian favorite. Right, it was the rabbis of Aleppo. Right, Aleppo is Syria. Right, the Shtarka Svardim. Right, the Syrians in Aleppo. What did they say? Burn the books. And we say burn the books. He wrote his commentaries in Chumash. So it wasn't just burn his commentary, it was burn the Chumash in which his commentary was found. It's a big deal. A big deal. Okay. Anyway. Okay, so now we move to Pasuk Hay and we start the journeys. And this is really an exciting part of Chumash. Basically a list of all of the places that Bnei Israel journeyed. Okay? And since we didn't do this back in Shmos, so we'll get to do it a little bit now. So the first pasuk says, "Vayis'u b'nei Yisrael me Ramses, vayachanu bisukos." That Bnei Yisrael left, they traveled from Ramses, and they encamped in Sukkos. Now, if any of you have the new Chumashim, right? I think, looking around, some of you have the new Chumashim. You'll see in the back, there is I don't have it here, but in the back, in one of the appendici, is that the correct word? Page 1351. You have it? Right? If the back of your Chumash has like page illustrations, yes, I gave it out to you once before. Right, if you don't have it, I'll print it out again. All right. So we see they left Ramses and they traveled to Sukkot. Now I mentioned last week at the end that Ramses and Ramses were two different places. Ramses was a place where they left Mitzrayim from which they left Mitzrayim, and Ramses was the place that they built that kept collapsing on quicksand. I have a question for you, okay? The holiday of Pesach, based on the word Pesach, means to pass over. What's that connected to? Right, not the mezuzah. It's connected to the blood, right? The blood that was put on the doorposts. The blood that was put on the doorposts of their homes, right? And if you remember, I mentioned last week that there was blood that was put on the doorposts from the Karban Pesach and from Bris Milah, right? And from Bris Milah, and Chedva said, "Wait a second, what are you talking about?" And we went a little bit down a rabbit hole, trying to uncover that. I did some research even afterwards, and it's not so clear in Chumash. You don't see it so clearly, right? But nevertheless, there are interpretations that explain that Bnei Yisrael did not do Bris Milah for many of the last years at which they were in Mitzrayim. In fact, this discussion appears in the Gemara when it comes. It's not a pasuk. We don't find it in Chumash, but it appears in the Gemara when the Gemara is discussing the requirements for conversion. So we know the Gemara says, okay, what are the requirements for conversion? So for a male, the requirements are bris milah, tevila, right, immersion in a mikvah, and kabbalas ol malchus shamayim, acceptance of mitzvos, kabbalas ha-mitzvos. Okay. For a woman, bris part is not there, obviously. So where do we derive this from? Like, how do we know that this is what happens to a convert? Maybe we should just make the convert eat chicken soup with matzo balls and say, oh, shine, you're Jewish, right? How do we know that this is the requirement? So the Gemara says, from what happened to the Jews when they left Egypt. There was a mass conversion of this Egyptian group of people known as the Hebrews to become Jewish. So Tina said before, what about Tvila? What about Kasha? None of that was relevant to them. They were not Jews from that perspective. They were not observant. They weren't guided by any system in Egypt. The system didn't come along until Har Sinai, till after they left Egypt. So in effect, the Gemara says, we learn that a prospective convert, or we learn that a convert needs bris milah because the Jews, before they left Egypt, the males went through bris milah. How do we know they went through bris milah? So the Gemara there says, because we have a pasuk, b'damai chayi, that I mentioned by a bris, and one of those dams is referring to the dam, to the blood of bris milah.
Okay, these are Jewish men that didn't do bris milah.
The Jewish, so obviously if they did a bris milah, right, you don't generally do a bris milah twice, right? So if they did a bris milah, what does that imply? That implies that they did not have a bris milah prior to this, right? It implies that they did not have a bris milah prior to this. Now, something's a little bit interesting because if you think about it, when Basia discovered the basket in which Moshe was floating, right? She sees the baby, and what does she say? She says, this must be one of the Jewish children. So there are now, why did she say that? Because there are no Egyptian children being put into the Nile River. So obviously, if there's a baby in a basket in the Nile River, must be Jewish. That seems to be pshat. But there are those who want to interpret that why did she say this was one of the Jewish children? Because she uncovered him. Right? She uncovered him, and what did she see? He was circumcised. Now, we say that Moshe Rabbeinu was born circumcised. But how else, why would Basia think that he was one of the Jews if she saw that he was circumcised, if the Jews had stopped doing bris milah?
Some of them are still doing it.
So it could be that some of them were still doing it, or could, right? Or right? Oh, so very interesting. So very interesting. This Gemara brings down that Shevet Levi never stopped doing bris milah. Right? The Gemara says that Shevet Levi continued throughout their time in Egypt to do bris milah. So maybe she knew from that. Right? It could be she knew from that, because remember the Shevet Levi, they were the priests, so maybe the Egyptians knew. So she knew he was. So this is interesting. So now did Shevet Levi do bris milah? Now they were doing bris milah because this is what the Jews did when they came down to Egypt. This is what the Jews did from the days of Abraham. Shevet Levi kept up that tradition. All the other Jews in Egypt stopped doing it, but Shevet Levi kept it up. Now it's time to leave. All the Jewish men who didn't have bris milah have a bris milah because it's part of this conversion according to the Gemara. What about Shevet Levi? Did they do a bris milah again? No. What did they do? They did the same thing that an adult does when an adult male who converts, who had a surgical circumcision, right, earlier in life. What does this adult male who converts, called hatafas dam bris? It's drawing a drop of blood from the place of the bris milah, right? That's what has to happen. And that's done, that is done in front of a bezdin. It's done in front of a bezdin. Ethiopians who were circumcised. There were many who were not circumcised, right? So sometimes you do a gerus, you do a conversion on a male who's not circumcised. So he needs a full circumcision, and that is a surgical procedure. You don't do that on an adult unless you're doing it, surgically, right? It's not like bagels and lox, in the morning, right? It's done surgically, but again, there needs to be a beis din that watches this surgical procedure take place. Tina.
I thought a person is Jewish as if he's born of a Jewish mother.
Nobody's Jewish yet. Nobody's Jewish yet. We're all converting.
Why do they need a bris if they could relate, if they...
There were no Jews yet. We were just a tribe. We were a tribe. We were a tribe that came. Remember, tribal affiliations were passed down through fathers, not through mothers. Right? We were a tribe, right? We were a tribe. We were the descendants of this tribe. Now, we refer to ourselves as Jews, right? Because we understand what Ivri means. We refer to ourselves as Jews. But we weren't technically Jews. We were this tribe that now is going through this process of becoming the Jewish people.
Then they have to travel.
So bris milah takes place, right? Bris milah takes place. What about tevilah? Where is tevilah? Where is immersion happening? At the Yam Suf. Now, this is an interesting, right? Because they really didn't get wet. Right? This was a tevilah, this was an immersion, but they walked on dry land through the Yam Suf. So it's sort of like a quasi, if you think about it, it doesn't fit 100%, right? Doesn't shtel, as they say, 100%, right? In other words, Bnei Israel walked through the Yam Suf. That's true. They were underwater, but they didn't get wet. But that was the tefillah of Bnei Israel. And obviously, Kabbalah's mitzvos was at Har Sinai, Na'aseh v'Nishma.
So it is accepted as going to Tefillah?
So that was the paradigm of tefillah, okay? So I guess if you could split the waters of the mikveh today, you could do it.
Maybe the mist.
Maybe.
Maybe the mist.
But when you convert, you're going from one religion to another.
Not necessarily.
No, not that, because the
I know.
the Hebrews were not, they were unaffiliated.
Well, they were unaffiliated, but they were defined by their
Ethnicity.
tribal, right, by their ethnicity, right? And that ethnicity came with certain things. So for instance, they knew there was a story of creation. They knew they had ancestors, right? They knew those things. In fact, some say every Shabbos they would get together and they would have cholent and kugel and, right? So there was this ethnicity, but they weren't halachic Jews. Halachic Judaism started at Yetzias Mitzrayim. So back to Chedva's question, where do we see this? We don't see it directly in Chumash. We see it, the Gemara derives it. Now, we also asked the question, how could it be? They did bris milah and then they traveled the next day. How could that be? So it must have been that they didn't do the bris milah the night before. Right? They didn't do the bris milah right at that time. They did bris milah earlier, 3 days earlier, or a few days earlier. They did bris milah earlier. And this was the blood that was kept over from the bris milah, and that's what they mixed together with the dam of the carbon pesach. It doesn't say that they actually did bris milah that night. That would have been very difficult to have done bris milah and then to everybody to leave Mitzrayim. Okay, so Chedva sent us down that. Thank you. You sent us down that rabbit hole. What?
Bris milah went on during the desert.
No, so that we know bris milah stopped in the desert. Right? Bris milah stopped. They observed the carbon, they observed Pesach once in the Midbar. The first year they were in the Midbar, they observed Pesach. Remember, the first Pesach, where were they? They were at a Pesach program in Egypt. Right? That was the first Pesach, right? The second Pesach, and they didn't have anything to talk about that night. Right? There was nothing to talk about. All they had to do was eat. Right? It was like a right? It's like a dream seder. What happens? You just sit down and eat. You don't have to say anything. Just sit down and eat. So now what happened? So the second Pesach, was observed the first year they were in Egypt. Now they had something to talk about. What they have to talk about, what happened last year. There was no other Pesach other than that first one in Mitzrayim, because there were any children who were born in the Midbar were not circumcised, because they never knew when they would have to pick up and travel. So in other words, it's dangerous to travel. Some say they didn't circumcise because of the winds in the Midbar that were dangerous. It's not exactly sanitary conditions, sand blowing all around, whatever.
We had clouds above and all over. And
Okay, Einachinami, that's true. That's true. But they didn't circumcise. Okay.
There must have been some children though, some boys who were born between Yitzias and Mitzrayim and first Pesach in the Midbar.
Right, so maybe, I don't know, maybe why? Between then and the first Pesach in the Midbar. So maybe they still did Bris Milah, because remember, that first Pesach in the Midbar, where were Bnei Yisrael? They were still encamped at Har Sinai. So they traveled for 49 days to get to Har Sinai, and then they were at Har Sinai for about a year. They didn't travel. They were at Har Sinai for about a year. So they could have been circumcised there. Okay, so let's go back. So we said they put the blood on the doorpost, right? They put the blood on the doorpost. Now, here's the question. Why did they have to put the blood on the doorpost? Because this way it identified the Jewish homes. What's pshat? It identified the Jewish homes. Right? Where were the Jews living? Where were the Jews living? So if the Jews were living in Goshen, right? And they were living by themselves, there were Jewish neighborhoods in Goshen. So what do you need signs on the door for? There's an Eruv here. This is a Jewish community, right? They have a mikveh, they have an Eruv, they have a pizza shop. It's a Jewish community. And why did Hashem need every Jew to put this on his door? So obviously they were no longer living in Goshen per se. Where were they living? They had moved out of Goshen, many of them, and they had become assimilated into Egyptian society, right? And now, when they're assimilated in Egyptian society, what happens? Now Hashem says, okay, which is that Jewish house over there, right? So that's right, the one with the sukkah still up in December, right? That's the Jewish house, right? So what happens?
The marble kitchen.
With the kitchen has to be redone. Right, so it's interesting. You think about it, right? Just think about it. There are still homes in Israel where the sukkahs are up, because for the past year, the men haven't been home to take down the sukkahs because they're out war. It's like just these perspectives. Just think about this. Okay, so what do you have? So you have obviously you have Jews spread among the Egyptians, hence the need to mark the doorposts, hence the need to pass over these homes, because they were not all in one place. And yet, when it comes time to leave, where do they go? Where do they leave from? From Ramses. Where is Ramses? Ramses is, according to most, a city in Goshen. It is a city in Goshen. So it's
a city in Goshen.
A city in the area called Goshen. Goshen was not a city. Goshen was an area. Like when you drive upstate, Goshen is a city, right? It's a city that we know all too well from our traffic tickets, right? Goshen, right? But there in Mitzrayim, Goshen was an area. So, and one of the cities in Goshen was Ramses. And it seems that literally what happened is Bnei Yisrael picked up from the homes where they were, and they walked to Ramses. So this actually explains nicely what we're talking about. We said, when did Bnei Yisrael leave Mitzrayim? Bnei Yisrael left Mitzrayim in the middle of the day. What do you mean the middle of the day? Why the middle of the day? Because they didn't want to sneak out like Ganavim at nighttime, right? They didn't want to leave first thing in the morning, before the bagels are baked, right? They don't, for the newspapers delivered. So they waited until the middle of the day when it's, all right, the sun is out, it's clear, we're leaving in the middle of the day. What were they doing the whole time? The night before they had eaten the Korban Pesach, what were they doing the whole morning? No, they weren't packing, because when they sat down at the Seder, they were supposed to be packed. Right, so think about a busy Erev Yantiv, right? They were supposed to be packed. So now what did they do? So they must have all traveled to Goshen, to Ramses, and assembled in Ramses. And now in Ramses, what are they doing? Now in Ramses, they are leaving. So they're all getting ready to leave now from Ramses, and we're told, Vayisu miram. It doesn't tell us that they traveled to Ramses, but they assembled in Ramses, and now we have, the Torah tells us, Vayisu b'nei Yisrael me Ramses vayachanu bisukos. They went from Ramses to Sukkos. If you look on your map, you see where, at least according to this interpretation, you see where Ramses and Sukkos are. Okay? They're different. You do some research, there are all different interpretations of where these stops are, but they went from Ramses to Sukkos. Okay. Why? And we're going to get a list now of a lot of places, right? Of all the places, the 42 places that they traveled. So why do we need such a detailed list of all of these 42 places? So there's a beautiful thought which is mentioned by the Malbim. Listen to what the Malbim writes.
Is it where they sinned in each place?
No. So the question was, why do we have a very dry list of places? So we're up to Pasuk Hey, right? So look at Pasuk Hey. Vayisu b'nei Yisrael mi Ramses vayachanu b'Sukkos. They left. They traveled from Ramses and they encamped in Sukkos. Vayisu mi Sukkos. They traveled from Sukkos vayachanu ve'esam, and they camped in Esam. Vayisu me'esam. In other words, what are we getting? We're getting a relatively dry list of places. Relatively dry list of places. Why? So Rashi, we learned Rashi at the very beginning of the Parsha, where Rashi said that the reason all of these places are listed, lahodia chasadav shalamakom, to teach us the greatness of a Kadosh Baruch Hu. Kadosh Baruch Hu says, I helped you out in this place, and I helped you out in this place, and I helped you out in this place, and in this place. Right? And there's also an interpretation that these were places in which they sinned. Right? So Kadosh Baruch Hu is mentioning these places as a reminder of their transgressions. But listen to what the Malbim writes. The Malbim says, Kasav Rambam b'Moreh Nevuchim. The Rambam writes in his Moreh Nevuchim. Moreh Nevuchim is the Rambam's guide for the perplexed. If you study it, you become perplexed. Right? Kasav Rambam b'Moreh Nevuchim shahayat tzorech gadol lahazkir hamasaos, that it was crucial, it's indispensable, absolutely important to list these places. Sheberabos hayamim yachsiv hashomea kol hanisim ha'elu shenasu liYisrael. Because what's going to happen? Many years later, people are going to talk about these miracles that happened to the Jews in Egypt, the manna, right? The man that fell, that accompanied them and in their journeys through Egypt, the be'er, right? The ananei al-kavod. They're going to hear about all these things. And what are people going to say? They're going to say it didn't really happen that way. But rather what? Vayomer, people will say, Ech efshar sha'amdu zman rav kazeh meshech 40 shana b'midbar ba'arava, be'eretz siyah ba'arava. How could this be? Vayomer, and people will say, Shebevadai amdu b'midbarios hakurovim el hayishuv, asher yashvu sham b'nei arav hayom. What are people going to say, writes the Rambam? People are going to say, when the Jews left Egypt, how did they traveled in the desert, but what does that mean? So I know that we have these visions of them going up sand dunes and down sand dunes, right? That didn't happen, right? There are no sand dunes in the Midbar Sinai. There are no sand. There are some sand dunes in Midbar Yehuda, but they weren't up to Midbar Yehuda yet.
Midbar Yehuda, that's like
Right? Midbar Yehuda is between the Jordan River and when you cross over the Jordan River. That's Midbar Yehuda. If you stand in, if you have a good view from Efrat, and you look east, right? You look east. There's sand dunes. There's not sand dunes like the Sahara sand dunes, but there are sand dunes and ups and downs. So says the Rambam, what's going to happen? What's going to happen is that people are going to say, you know what? Where did these Jews travel? They must have traveled to places close to settlements, right? Where people lived. And what did they do? They bartered for food. They bartered for drink. They didn't go out into the desert where there was nobody there, and they were sustained miraculously through this bread that fell from Shamayim and this water that flowed from the rock, and they were protected by these clouds. No, what really happened for 40 years? They traveled in places that were close to habitation, that were close to places that people dwelled in. So they could interact, they could trade, they could barter, there was protection. That's what the Rambam says they're going to say. And what happened? So says the Rambam, as the result of this tendency of human nature to say that, the Torah is now giving us a list, and giving us a list of places where we say, wait, they went here, they went here, they went here. All of these places, some of them initially are near, right? Because they traveled to these first places within the first 7 days to give the impression that they were lost, they were trapped, in order to entice Paro to run after them, to chase them. But after that, they were in the Midbar, they weren't near anybody. Maybe there was a nomad here or there. They weren't near. Maybe it was a Bedouin encampment somewhere, but they weren't near anybody. And says the Rambam, that's why the Torah is very specific in the names of these places, so that we have these maps that tell us where they traveled, and we know that they didn't travel next to habitated areas. They were traveling mamish in a desert that was not a place of habitation. How did they survive? Rambam says, Torah tells us how they survived. They survived because they had lechem from Shamayim, they had water from the Be'er, they had these ananei akavod protecting them. That's how they survived. So says the Rambam, this is not merely a list of places, right? But this is a AAA triptych of the miraculous interventions by Hashem in sustaining Bnei Israel in the Midbar. Okay. So the first place they come to is a place called Sukkos. Right? Interesting. A place called Sukkos. Why was this place called Sukkos? Why is it? What?
Was it Sukkot by then?
Was it Sukkot then? Well,
It's Nisan.
right. So it's Nisan, right? It's in the springtime. So
Sukkot is 6 months later.
they didn't have, it wasn't Sukkot time. Wasn't Sukkot time, but Sukkot is dafka not at Sukkot time. In other words, Sukkot is at Sukkot time on the Jewish calendar. But think about this year. It's going to be a little bit chilly in the Sukkah. It's going to be a little bit chilly in the Sukkah. Right? Now, I remember we've had years where there was snow, right, in the Sukkah. Right? It's going to be a little bit chilly. It's going to be a little bit chilly in the Sukkah. What? No, listen, in Florida they have walls. They build half walls to their Sukkah. Why? Because they need, it's so hot. They need air. They put ceiling fans in their Sukkah. Right? So I know that years I have had ceiling fans in my Sukkah. That was a great year. We hooked up a ceiling fan to the Sukkah. It was amazing. And then there were years where you need a heater in the Sukkah because it's so cold. This is going to be one of the heater in the Sukkah years. Because when is Sukkot happening? Mid-October. Right, mid-October. It might be a little bit chilly in the Sukkah. Right? This is pretty much as late as it gets. Right? It might be a little bit chilly in the Sukkah. We have had snow in October. It does happen. It can happen. Okay. So Sukkot is not at Sukkos weather time. Right? When is Sukkos? When is Sukkos weather time?
Autumn.
Fall. I'm sorry, maybe not fall, but fall, spring, right? When Sukkos weather time is at Pesach. Right? It's at Pesach. It's beautiful. It's spring. It's getting warmer, not getting colder. It's getting warmer.
Pesach is in the spring.
Pesach is in the spring. That's the appropriate time to have the holiday of Sukkot. Why? Because it's beautiful outside. It's springtime. Everybody wants to be out. It's getting warmer, not getting colder.
The rabbis
Right.
made this date?
What?
So the rabbis made this date to be cold?
The housewives made this date. Right? The women said, "What are you going to give? You're going to give us 2 holidays back to back like this? Forget about it." Right? So, right? So all of the wives complained, and they made the holiday of Sukkot in Tishrei. Michelle.
In South Africa, even in Tishrei, it happened in springtime, Sukkot.
Right.
Because of the opposite way.
Right. Correct. But everything is based on Eretz Yisrael. Right? Everything. I mean, even though I was talking about here, everything is based on Eretz Yisrael. And in Eretz Yisrael, it's taka. Right? It's beautiful now, right? It's beautiful now. Right? It starts to be the rainy season, right? Sukkot is that when the rainy season is supposed to start. Right? They hope, right? Right. Okay. All right.
It was a joke, but seriously? Seriously?
No, so the reason Sukkot falls out, the reason, I guess it's not so much a reason if you think about Eretz Yisrael, right? But certainly for Jews who live in the diaspora, we'll leave South Africa out of this. Certainly for Jews who live in the diaspora, it's Sukkot time can be a little bit chilly. So why am I leaving my house and going into the sukkah when it's chilly, or in Eretz Yisrael maybe it's rainy? Right? Why am I doing that? I'm doing that because I have to fulfill a mitzvah. In other words, I'm not doing it just because it's nice outside. I'm doing it because I have to fulfill a mitzvah. Okay, so it could be that this place was called Sukkos because it was marked by people living in booths, in huts. Right? They lived in booths, they lived in huts, and that's why it's called Sukkot. But it's actually possible that there's another reason as well, and that is, this is when Bnei Yisrael first experienced the Ananei HaKavod. Right? In other words, this is when Bnei Yisrael were first enveloped by the Ananei HaKavod. What do we say when we sit in our sukkah? Leman yedu dorosechem, so that everybody should know, generations should know, ki b'sukkos hoshavti es b'nei Yisrael, right? That Bnei Yisrael dwelled in Sukkos when they left Egypt. When we sit in the sukkah, what are we supposed to be thinking about? Yetzias Mitzrayim. When we sit in the sukkah, we're supposed to be saying, what's the reason I'm sitting in the sukkah? I'm sitting in the sukkah in order to remind myself that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave Bnei Yisrael Sukkos when they left Egypt. Right? Now, what does that mean?
We never think of it that way. We think, okay, so the agriculture and our wealth and this and that.
Okay, so I'm telling you. So now you have something else to think about this year, right? You're thinking of that. Bnei Yisrael were kept in Sukkot. Hashem provided them Sukkot when they left. So there's a machlokes in the Gemara as to what does this pasuk mean. Leman yedu.
Dorotecha.
I don't remember. I just had the language; it just flew out of my head. Ki b'sukos hoshavti es b'nei Yisrael. So the Gemara has a machlokas. What does it mean? Ki b'sukos hoshavti es b'nei Yisrael. That I put b'nei Yisrael in Sukkos. So one opinion is Sukkos mamish. What did they live in? Right. In other words, they're traveling in the midbar. When you're traveling in the midbar, what do you live in? You know, they didn't have. Right. Think about it for a second. You know, today you go camping. I don't know if any of you ever go camping, right? Never, right? Right, never, right? You go camping, but when you go camping, and where do you sleep when you go camping? So if you're Jewish, what do they call it? Glamping, right? So if you're Jewish, you go camping, and what do you sleep in? Luxurious kind of rustic place. But people go camping; they sleep in tents. My kids. We did this when my kids were young, and my kids are actually doing it now, some of them, right? They go camping with their family and they sleep in a tent. Now, when you put up the tent, right, it's pretty easy today. You have poles that go together and canvas or fabric that spreads over the poles, and you sleep in the tent. What did Bnei Yisrael sleep in? Right? Imagine all these Jews left Mitzrayim, and now they come to a place and it's dark and it's nighttime and the kids are kvetchy. What they sleep in? Did they sleep under the stars? Or maybe they just slept under the stars. They just or maybe they set up some kind of temporary dwelling place, which we'll call sukkos, or which a tent or something like that, and that's where they slept. That's one interpretation. Another interpretation is that it was the sukkos, not sukkos mamish, but the ananei hakavod. The ananei hakavod enveloped Bnei Yisrael. And what we'll talk about next week is what's the source for these ananei hakavod? Why did they envelop them here, and did they stay with them the whole time? And if it did, then how come Bnei Yisrael had this whole issue with going through Yam Suf? We'll talk about that in Mir Hashem next week. Have a great week, everybody.
Thank you.